Hey, I'm Jim Dewey, and this is Combating the Narrative. So this is part 2 of my research into the Korean War, namely the failure of US and UN intelligence agencies to predict the intervention of the Chinese on the behalf of the North Koreans. This is meant to be case in point of why people should not blindly trust those who claim to be experts. All the fancy research and credentialing that these intelligence experts at the CIA had certainly didn't help them predict what was an obvious Chinese invasion. If you haven't seen part 1 of the video, I'd recommend you go check that out first. Otherwise, before we pick up right where we left off in September of 1950, I'd like to share with you guys a document from this same CIA source linked in the description, containing a few choice quotes from General Douglas MacArthur's testimony before Congress regarding the failure in North Korea. MacArthur recalls in May of 1951 before Congress, "We had knowledge that the Chinese communists had collected large forces along the Yalu. My own reconnaissance, you understand, was limited entirely to Korea. But the general information which was available from China and other places indicated large accumulations of troops. The Red Chinese at that time were putting out almost daily statements that they were not intervening, that these were volunteers only." By volunteers, he's referring to the large number of Chinese on the Korean peninsula participating in the war. Apparently, the CIA and other intelligence agencies must have thought that these Chinese troops were massing on the border to have a picnic or play mahjong or something. But I digress. In any case, MacArthur continues, about the middle of September 1950, our Secretary of State announced that there was little chance and no logic in Chinese intervention. In November, our Central Intelligence Agency here had said that they felt that there was little chance of any major intervention on the part of Chinese forces. The Secretary of State and the CIA were apparently unconcerned with the large number of Chinese forces massing on the border, the large number of Chinamen actively participating in the war, and the direct threats from the leaders in the Chinese Communist government that they were going to intervene if the United States and UN had crossed the 38th parallel, which they did at this point. Now MacArthur continues. Now you must understand that the intelligence that a nation is going to launch a war is not an intelligence that is available to a commander limited to a small area of combat. That intelligence should have been given to me. Now, according to the CIA, MacArthur goes on to claim that the CIA and other Washington agencies were withholding information from him that they had obtained or could obtain from outside his own Far East theater of operations. Now, I'm inclined to believe that he actually did claim this. There's no reason to believe that he didn't, but the CIA does not give a direct quote in their own internal documentation here. Continuing on, MacArthur says that he was, quote, limited by the two conditions, the size of the force he had, and the mission that was given to him, to clear out all North Korea, to unify it, and to liberalize it. As a matter of fact, the disposition of those troops, in his opinion, could not have been improved upon had he known the Chinese were going to attack. The difficulty that arose was not the disposition of his troops, but the overwhelming number of the enemy force and the extraordinary limitations that were placed upon him in the use of his air force. And he says in no uncertain terms that, quote, had I been permitted to use my air when those Chinese forces came in there, I haven't the faintest doubt we would have thrown them back. To crystallize it for you, MacArthur is making quite the claim. He's stating bluntly that if the CIA or State Department had information that the Chinese were going to invade, it was withheld from him for reasons unknown. And even if he had been given advance knowledge that the Chinese were going to invade, there was nothing he could have even done. He was outnumbered by almost a literal order of magnitude. And the one thing he did have at his disposal, the one advantage he had over the Chinese, his air force, he wasn't allowed to use, at least not properly. MacArthur is saying that either the experts in the conduct of war and collection of intelligence were either woefully inept, or they had deliberately hung him out to dry. In either case, we again come to the conclusion that you should never trust an expert. Let's see if the CIA's own internal documents corroborate what MacArthur had to say on the matter. Now, on October 3rd, 1950, the CIA notes that the Chinese Communists, under Zhou Enlai, had threatened that if UN-US forces cross the 38th parallel, they will intervene. This information comes to them from the Indian ambassador in Peiping, or Beijing. In the face of this information, the CIA comments that they're certain the Chinese Communists will not intervene if, as now seems likely, now being October 1950, they anticipate that war with the United Nations would result. They dismiss this intelligence report as a, quote, plant to influence US-UK policy. No credence is attached to the Indian report, even though, to this point, there are numerous reports of irregular Chinese troop movements, reports that the Chinese propaganda mill has been working overtime, and so many Chinese volunteers, quote-unquote, participating in the war on the Korean Peninsula that, according to one POW, an entire North Korean division is mostly comprised of North Korean volunteers. But no, the experts say that Lamau, the Chinese are bluffing. If you don't believe it, you're a bigot. Now, on the 9th of October, the CIA, in their daily summary, again repeats the assertion that this is just a bluff designed to deter UN-US forces from going beyond the 38th parallel. The CIA says that the Chinese are probably just making these statements to placate the Russians, a statement for which no basis is given. Like, they're just saying that. They've got nothing to back it up. And they assess that even if they had the political willpower to do so, the Chinese supply and economic situation is just too difficult for them to go through with intervention. The CIA also receives a report from Chinese nationalists holed up on Taiwan that China has sent 6 divisions into North Korea. 6 whole divisions. Now, real life isn't Hearts of Iron 4, like these aren't just little sprites on a computer screen. To put it in perspective for you, the United States Army currently only has 11 active duty divisions. This is a lot of men. This is a lot to miss, and it's certainly a lot to just hand wave away. But that's exactly what the CIA does. Instead of, sounding the alarm bells about this, it's mentioned in passing next to a report apparently filleting a, quote, peace-loving Mao Zedong. They don't even make any comment on the Chinese communist troop movements. They just mention it in passing. And now, on the 16th of October, the CIA acknowledges that they've received reports of 4 divisions of unidentified troops, presumed to be Chinese communists, crossing the Manchurian border into Korea. The CIA comments that there have been numerous reports of this nature, but they discount them as probably being a repetition of earlier reports. Precisely why the fact that it's a repetition of earlier reports would matter is unclear. And again, on the 16th of October, the CIA claims that the Chinese will probably not intervene openly. Only 4 days after the CIA statement that the Chinese will probably not openly intervene, the 20th of October, they receive a report that mentions that the Chinese have decided to intervene. 400,000 Chinese communist troops are reported to have moved to the Korean border. Not only that, but they're given the dates they're going to cross sometime between the 18th of October and the 20th of October, and that the Chinese communist-controlled Central Air Transportation Corporation had recently had an urgent and unexpected air operations conference in Peiping. In response to these facts, the CIA now reverses itself, saying that, well, the Chinese have the capability to intervene, where before the supply challenges would have been too great to intervene. But the best time for them to have done that has passed, and the Chinese Communists and Soviet Union are, quote, not willing to assume the increased risk of a third world war, which would result from direct Chinese Communist intervention in Korea. So certain is the CIA that the Chinese communists are not going to intervene, despite a mountain of evidence to the contrary, that they don't even mention the Korean situation in their weekly summary or daily summary until the 28th of October 1950, 8 days after this. And when they next mention the Korean situation, guess what it is the CIA has to say? They cite reports from two unidentified CIA sources. Now there's a redaction here, but it's too short for them to mention who those sources are. That a Chinese communist decision against intervention was made in early October at a conference in Peiping. During this meeting, apparently the Chinese Communist, Soviet, and North Korean leaders called for the following: a withdrawal of North Korean main forces to Manchuria, if they cannot resist the UN crossing of the 38th parallel, and guerrilla operations in Korea by the balance of the forces. And it's now that the CIA sources admit that Chinese communist units, not just volunteers, but Chinese Communist Army units, had already been in North Korea for some time, but that the bulk of these units had already been withdrawn, leaving only skeleton forces in order to create an impression of strength in order to deceive U.S. intelligence. Now, I'm very anxious to know who this source is that's reporting this information to CIA command, which then passed it on to the desk of the President of the United States. I'm beginning to wonder if there even were sources at all for this information, because it's very clear that this meeting that they're referencing never took place, and that even if a meeting of that nature had taken place, they certainly hadn't come to the conclusion that they weren't going to intervene and that they were going to withdraw across the Manchurian border. Again, the question is now floating around in my mind of, was this really just incompetence? Can anyone be this incompetent? Or was this deliberate misinformation? Now, on the 30th of October 1950, according to the U.S. Eighth Army interrogations of Chinese POWs, 3 Chinese communist divisions are now in Korea for certain. We've heard 6, we've heard 4, we've heard 3. There's definitely some, and it's definitely a lot. You know what the CIA says about this information? Less than 30 days before the Chinese army launches a massive offensive? The CIA continues to believe that direct Chinese communist intervention in Korea is unlikely at this time. The CIA asserts that the presence of Chinese communist units in Korea has not been confirmed, and says that these reports can't possibly be accurate because they don't come from high-ranking officers in the Chinese army. They're coming from grunts who can't possibly be in a position to know about whether or not Chinese forces are in North Korea somehow. And it's almost comical at this point. Like, the CIA is now sitting for sure on a mountain of evidence that at least something is going down with the Chinese in Korea. You know, I don't know that they can know the size and scope of the intervention, but there's definitely one coming. And the blind can see it, but somehow the CIA are just like stricken with a case of massive retardation. And they're supposed to be the experts on these matters. Like, they're the ones whose responsibility this is. Like, their lives and livelihoods are dedicated to this. And they're either wrong or they're deliberately misleading the United States, in which case, like, they're still not to be trusted, obviously. Like, that's worse than being wrong. Like, the CIA is now dismissing, at this point, U.S. Eighth Army intelligence reports saying that these Chinese communist privates that they captured were sent to North Korea to plant misleading reports in the hopes of slowing the UN advance. Like, this feels like the type of person who would have been a Twitter moderator or something like that. Like, any information out there that disagrees with what I believe is disinfo and wrong and bad. So don't believe it. But it's like, now at this point, there's so much evidence to the contrary of what they're seeing that the CIA is now backpedaling. They're saying on the 30th of October that there were Chinese communist units along the Manchurian-Korean border, which may be moved across the border to form a cordon sanitaire around the Suiho hydroelectric plants and other nearby installations. So now the CIA is saying, well, it looks like they're probably getting ready to intervene, but if they do, it's just to protect their own, economic interests. They really just don't want us to hurt those power plants. They definitely aren't like going to launch an offensive or anything. They would never do that. If they intervened, it would just be on a limited basis to protect some hydroelectric plants. It's like, my God. Like, they're privy to all this information that I've shared in the last video and this video, all the troop movements and the direct reports from Chou En-lai himself that he's going to intervene. And they're not even advising caution here. They're not even like, well, maybe we want to like mobilize the army back home because it's going to take 6 weeks for us to intervene. And like, by that point, we may as well just pack it up and give up on North Korea because, we'll have been pushed into the sea. They're not like, hey, maybe we should get all the armies in Europe prepared to potentially mobilize to the Korean peninsula, or ask Omar Bradley to send a couple of his armies over to the Korean peninsula preemptively. They don't even have to be engaged in combat. They don't even have to be there. Like, just get them ready to do so. Like, wheels up in 18 hours type stuff. Like, even if they don't believe it, the amount of movement on this, like, prudence would dictate that you would do something about this information, and they're not only sitting on it, but they're downplaying it. And so a day later, on the 31st of October, 1950, the U.S. 8th Army again is reporting that Chinese troops were reported, in combat in North Korea, and that they probably entered on or about the 16th of October. And the U.S. 8th Army at this point is like, they're probably engaged in combat with us in our combat sector. It's not entirely clear, it's not like it's up close and personal. But they sure look Chinese and sound Chinese. The only thing that's completely unclear is whether or not they're independent Chinese communist units or integrated with the North Korean units. And the CIA just sticks its head in the sand again. Like, the CIA does not believe that their appearance indicates that the Chinese communists intend to intervene directly or openly in the Korean War. Like, it's just comical. Like, it reminds me of this clip from Family Guy right here.
Nope. Sorry. Kevin Bacon wasn't in Footloose.
What? Of course he was.
No, he wasn't. You lose.
Of course he was. He was the star.
Nope, you're wrong. Look it up.
I don't have to look it up. It's common knowledge.
Nope.
He was on the cover of People magazine when the movie everyone knows Kevin Bacon was a star of Footloose. It was a huge movie. He was the lead.
No.
On that note, we're going to wrap it up here. I'm trying to keep these videos to about 15 to 20 minutes-ish to make them a little more easily digestible. And if you made it to this point, thank you. I'm glad you at least found it interesting, and I'd hope you'd consider subscribing or rating or commenting or doing something else that lets me know this video is worthwhile. With that, I'm Jim Dewey, and this is Combating the Narrative.